The sky was overcast, and the moon only appeared behind dark clouds that moved slowly. Sarah was driving her car on a deserted road at midnight, returning home after a long day at work. Soft music played in the background, but it wasn't enough to dispel the strange feeling creeping over her. The road was known for being short, but dark, with streetlights sparsely placed. As the minutes passed, Sarah noticed that the fog was becoming denser, making visibility more difficult. She decided to slow down, but her anxiety grew with every mile she drove. Suddenly, a strange sign appeared on the side of the road. It read, "Warning! Road closed in 5 miles." Sarah stopped for a moment, wondering how the road could be closed without any prior notice. However, she decided to continue, thinking she could find an alternative route if necessary. After a few minutes, Sarah noticed that the fog had thickened even more, and visibility was nearly non-existent. Then, out of nowhere, an old car appeared, moving very slowly in front of her. She tried to overtake it, but every time she attempted to speed up, the old car did the same, as if trying to prevent her from passing. Sarah's heart pounded. She felt that something was terribly wrong. She decided to call her friend Lisa to tell her what was happening, but when she picked up her phone, there was no signal. She tried turning on the radio, but all she heard was strange static. Then suddenly the old car came to a complete stop in the middle of the road. Sarah stopped behind it, unable to pass due to the dense fog. The driver of the old car, a tall man wearing a black coat, stepped out and started walking toward her car with slow, eerie steps. Sarah didn't wait to see what would happen. She quickly turned her car around in a sharp maneuver and sped back the way she came. She could hear the sound of footsteps chasing after her, but she didn't dare look back. When she finally reached the beginning of the road, she noticed that the fog had begun to clear. She stopped at a nearby gas station where the attendant looked at her in astonishment. "Are you okay? You look pale," the man said. She told him what had happened, and he fell silent for a moment before saying, "We've heard about that road before. They say it's haunted. Many have disappeared there and never returned." From that day on, Sarah never went near that road again. But on certain nights when the sky was overcast, she would remember those footsteps chasing her and wonder, who was that man, and what did he want? On a chilly fall evening in the small town of Hesville, located in the heart of Kansas, Amelia Carter, a 36-year-old graphic designer, had just finished a weekend trip to visit her parents at their farm in the countryside. The weekend had been peaceful, filled with laughter and stories as Amelia and her 3 children, Lucas 10, Mia 7, and Noah 5, enjoyed their time away from the city. Now the Carter family was on their way back to their home in the city, about an hour's drive away. Amelia was looking forward to getting home, but she wasn't prepared for what would unfold on that dark road. It was just after 8 p.m. when they left, and the winding rural road was eerily quiet. Amelia glanced in the rearview mirror, her reflection dimly lit by the cabin lights. Lucas and Mia were chatting and laughing in the back seat. Noah, who was always the sleepy one, had curled up in his booster seat, barely awake. "Are you guys ready to go home?" Amelia said, her voice tired but cheerful. "Yes," Lucas answered eagerly. "I miss playing on my video games." Mia added, "I can't wait to tell my friends about the horses." The drive was peaceful at first, the soft hum of the car tires blending with the sounds of nighttime insects. But as time passed, a sense of unease began creeping into Amelia's heart. The sky had grown very dark, and the road was becoming unfamiliar. There were no longer any houses around them, just wide fields and pastures, with the occasional distant light from a home or farm. Amelia looked at the GPS and said quietly, "About 45 minutes left." The children settled into a comfortable silence, but Amelia began to feel something strange. The road seemed darker than usual, and there were no streetlights around them. Suddenly, something happened that made Amelia's heart race faster, something she couldn't explain. All familiar sounds of the countryside had vanished, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. "Mom, what's that?" Lucas asked suddenly, looking out the window. Amelia looked at the road ahead, her eyes following the faint headlights of their car. There was nothing in sight, but an eerie feeling washed over her. It felt like the road she was driving on wasn't the same, as if something strange was following them from the shadows that surrounded them. She didn't respond to Lucas's question, and the children's voices in the back grew quieter as Noah continued to doze in his seat. But in an instant, the car stopped suddenly. The engine had stalled, as though time itself had stopped in that moment. Amelia tried to start the engine again, but it wouldn't turn over. A heavy feeling settled in her chest, and the air around her felt unusually cold. They were in a very remote area, far past the last house they had passed. "What's going on?" she muttered to herself, trying to reassure the children. But it wasn't enough. The fear was intensifying, especially with the sudden sound she heard coming from afar, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Amelia continued to try starting the car, but the engine refused to cooperate, as if something was preventing it from moving. The children began to grow anxious, each one asking her why the car had stopped. "Mom, why did we stop?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with fear. Amelia tried to stay calm, though her heart was pounding loudly. She looked out the window, but the darkness was so thick she could barely see anything. The sound that was growing nearer and nearer resembled heavy footsteps, accompanied by a low moan. The footsteps seemed to move around the back of the car, as if circling it. The more Amelia tried to start the car, the louder the sound became, as if something was trapping them. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. The sound disappeared completely, as if a ghost had vanished into the air. Amelia breathed a sigh of relief for a moment, thinking that maybe it was all just her imagination, but in that instant a light appeared in the distance, getting closer. It was a car coming. "Mom! There's a car!" Mia shouted excitedly. Amelia felt a mix of relief and fear. As the car got closer, it stopped beside them. The driver was an elderly man wearing a cap, and he seemed surprised to see a car stopped in such a dark place. "Are you all okay?" he asked. "Yes, we just need some help. My car stopped and I can't get it started," Amelia said, her voice shaky, but she felt a sense of relief. The man nodded and said, "Let me see what I can do." As the man tried to assist her, Amelia decided to get out of the car and check if there was anything unusual around them. But as she turned her head, she caught something in the side mirror. It was a dark shape, not quite distinguishable, but it was moving slowly behind them as if watching them. Her heart began to race even faster, but the elderly man returned and told her the car just needed a few more attempts to start the engine. Thankfully, with some effort, the car started again. Amelia glanced back into the darkness, but she saw nothing. "Thank you so much," she said to the driver, who smiled and pointed toward the road. "You're fine now. Keep going." Everyone got back into the car, and Amelia drove faster, pushing the thoughts of what had just happened out of her mind. It was the first time she had ever felt such overwhelming fear. But even though they had made it through, the strange image she had seen in the side mirror stayed with her, reminding her that there are things in this world that may be bigger and more powerful than the fear we feel. It was 11:47 p.m. Laura was driving her small car down a dark highway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Behind her was a crowded wedding in a remote rural town, and ahead lay a 2-hour drive back to the city. Despite the summer season, the air was unusually cold, and a creeping mist was rising between the dense trees on either side of the road. Hoping to avoid the busy main highway filled with heavy trucks, she decided to take a shortcut through the forest. She told herself, this road is quieter, faster, and most importantly, free of trucks. But she didn't realize that this decision would change her night forever. With every mile she drove, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, as if the trees were closing in around her, swallowing every trace of light. Suddenly her headlights began to flicker. Her heart skipped a beat, but she tried to calm herself. "It's just a minor electrical issue," she muttered. But it wasn't just a minor issue. Minutes into her uneasy drive, she spotted something strange in her side mirror. The reflection of headlights from another car appeared behind her. Relief washed over her. Seeing another vehicle on this desolate road made her feel less alone. But as she glanced again, she noticed the lights were approaching unnaturally fast, almost as if the driver was chasing her. The car behind her closed the distance quickly, and its blinding headlights flooded her car, making it difficult to see the road ahead. She honked and moved aside, expecting the driver to pass, but the car didn't. It remained behind her, following her at a fixed distance, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. "That's enough!" Laura exclaimed, slamming on the brakes to force the other car to stop. But when she turned to confront the driver, there was nothing there. The road behind her was empty, silent, as if the car had never existed. She gathered herself and restarted her car. The radio, which had been off for the entire drive, suddenly turned on, broadcasting a faint whisper. The sound was strange, as though it was coming from deep underground. The words were unintelligible, but they were cold and unsettling. She reached to turn it off, but it persisted, growing clearer. "You can't leave." Her panic mounted as she glanced nervously into the rearview mirror and saw something shifting in the back seat. It was blurry and indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. "This is just exhaustion," she whispered, her voice shaking as she pressed harder on the gas. Minutes passed, and she realized she was circling back to the same point on the road, over and over again. The signs, the trees, even the small rocks by the roadside were identical. It was as if she was trapped in an endless loop. While trying to make sense of it, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. A tall man dressed entirely in black, standing motionless. His face was hidden under the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. She slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet fog-covered road, and the car stopped just feet away from him. The man began to approach her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The glass window separated them, but he raised a hand and gestured for her to lower it. Her heart pounded violently, but an unseen force compelled her to obey. As she rolled down the window, the air around her grew heavy, oppressive. The man spoke in a voice as cold as the grave. "This road is not yours to take. And now you can never leave." She tried to respond, but her words caught in her throat. Suddenly, darkness engulfed her. The headlights shut off completely, the engine died, and when she opened her eyes, she was somewhere entirely different. She found herself in the middle of an abandoned lot, her car battered and dented. The highway she had been on was nowhere to be seen. Later, the police discovered her car in that desolate place, but Lara was gone. Surveillance cameras on the main road showed her entering the forest, but there was no record of her ever leaving it. On a cold winter night in the small town of Harrisville, my name is Michael, and I work at a 24/7 bar in my town known for its pizza and drinks. We don't really offer much else, but people seem to love what we serve. I never really understood why the owners decided we should deliver pizzas. It's a lot of hassle for probably not much extra money, but since there weren't many delivery orders, I was always the only driver during the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. That night, I walked into the bar, which was packed with people. There were several large groups, and with delivery orders being slow, I helped out with waiting tables. In the meantime, there were a few deliveries I made, maybe once every hour. At 3 a.m. or Beiser, I had another regular delivery to drop off. I grabbed the pizza and got in my car. The address was 15 minutes away, so I typed it into Google Maps and began driving. Everything seemed normal, up until this point. The drive was peaceful, and I was happy to get away from the busy bar and onto the quiet roads. But then, something strange happened. Suddenly, my Google Maps said I had arrived. I wasn't even in a neighborhood. I pulled over and tried to figure out where I had gone wrong. After double-checking, the address was indeed correct. It led me to the entrance of a forest preserve or park or something. There were no houses nearby, so I was confused. I called the customer's number. It rang for less than a second before they picked up. "Hey, this is Michael. I'm trying to deliver your pizza, but I think you gave us the wrong address." There was an oddly long pause as I could hear the guy breathing on the phone before he described my car and told me to look to my left. I did as he said and saw nothing but complete darkness. Then I saw something move. It was him, waving his arms in the air to get my attention. He was standing in the forest behind the road. I had no idea why he didn't just come to the side of the road where it was easier to see, or even why he'd ordered it here to begin with. I got out of the car and started walking over. It was hard not to notice how eerily quiet it was next to the forest preserve. There were no cars or people around. As I walked up, I noticed the guy didn't move. He just stood there watching me walk across the street and up to the grass, right before the edge of the forest where he was. I stopped halfway across the grass, realizing how weird this was getting. I waved for him to come grab the pizza and pay for it. The guy hesitated, and instead of walking up to me, he looked behind me and around, obviously checking for any bystanders. My nerves were on edge at this point, which made it hard to think clearly. If my mind was clear, I definitely would have turned and run back to my car, but I didn't. The guy started walking toward me quickly, not slowing down. When he got close, I stumbled back, but it was too late. He grabbed my upper arm and started pulling me toward the forest. He was clearly trying to stay quiet, not yelling, but putting all his strength into pulling me. We struggled for several seconds before I realized I couldn't break free. I started punching him, and after a few clean shots to the face, he let go. By then, We were only a few feet from the forest. I ran as fast as I could, looking back only to check if he was following. To my horror, I saw him get up and run into the forest. But then, two other guys came out from behind the trees. I rushed to my car, started it up, and drove straight to the police station just around the block. However, by the time I got there, the men had completely vanished. I returned to work after that, explaining what happened to my boss and asking if he had any information about the order. All he had was a phone number, which was already disconnected, and a first name that was most likely fake. He sent me home early with a free slice of pizza, which honestly didn't feel like a fair trade, but I wasn't complaining. If I had been foolish enough to walk up to the forest that night, I probably would have been jumped by all three men with no witnesses around. Luckily, my hesitation to approach made it easier to escape, but things could have turned much worse, and what could have been just another delivery turned into a fight for my life. I've always been the type of person who doesn't buy into strange stories about things happening to ordinary people. I considered myself a down-to-earth guy, someone who wasn't easily swayed by superstition. But what happened to me that night made me rethink everything. It all started with a work trip, driving down an isolated road in a remote area. I had driven this route before, so I wasn't worried. It was already dark, and the only thing that bothered me was the absolute silence around me. There were no streetlights, no houses, just asphalt and trees stretching on both sides of the road. According to my GPS, I still had about 50 minutes to go until the next gas station, so I wasn't too concerned. But as time passed, the fuel gauge started dropping faster than I expected. At first I thought it would be fine, but as the gauge continued to fall, I realized I might not make it. That's when an uneasy feeling crept over me. I knew I was in the middle of nowhere, and the last sign of civilization had been miles behind. It was one of those moments where you just think, of course, this would happen to me, but you try to stay positive. Still, with every passing minute, the fuel gauge kept dropping lower, and sure enough, the car came to a stop. I just sat there in the driver's seat, in complete silence, trying to figure out what to do next. As expected, my phone had no signal. I took a deep breath and got out of the car to look around, even though I knew there was absolutely nothing but bushes and trees. The road was completely empty, lit only by the car's headlights. I decided to walk a little, hoping to spot any light or a house. That's when I realized just how strange the silence was. I could hear my own footsteps on the asphalt, which only made the isolation feel worse. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something. It sounded like branches breaking, distant but strong. I quickly got back into the car and sat there listening. I tried to convince myself it was just some animal, maybe a deer or something, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like heavy footsteps, coming and going. I'm not easily scared, but the way the sound stopped and started gave me a sense of dread. It was like whatever was making those steps was circling the car, and the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't any normal animal. Those steps had a rhythm, like something or someone was moving around the car, not bothering to be discreet. Then, at one point, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something at the edge of the headlights. It looked like a tall figure, but it was just a blurry shadow. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. So I blinked. When I looked again, the figure was a little closer, moving slowly but with a disturbing calmness. I tried to swallow the fear rising in my chest, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the shape, not understanding what was going on. After what felt like forever, the figure took a few more steps, coming more into the light. Now I could see it was something or someone tall, with a silhouette that didn't look normal. I couldn't make out any details. Just the shadow of something skinny with a slightly hunched posture, like it was watching me. And I swear, it seemed to have eyes, or at least two dark spots, that fixed on me. Just remembering that moment still gives me chills. That's when I started praying. I didn't care to whom. I just wanted that thing to go away. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, and I couldn't move a muscle. The figure stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. But instead of feeling relieved, it made everything feel even stranger. It was like time had frozen in that moment, no sound, no movement. Just me, the figure, and that suffocating silence. I was trapped in that intense fear. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of an engine coming from a distance. I've never been so glad to hear an engine in my life. A truck was coming. You know that feeling when you think you're saved? That's exactly what I felt. I waved frantically, and the truck stopped. The driver looked at me with a confused expression, probably wondering what I was doing out there alone. The figure, it vanished. I don't know how or where it went, but the second the truck arrived, it was gone. I climbed into the truck without a second thought, just grateful for the help, praying to get out of there as quickly as possible. But I knew what I had seen wasn't just in my head, and I'm pretty sure the driver could see it on my face that something truly strange had happened. He drove me to the next gas station, where I could finally breathe and try to pull myself together. But the feeling didn't go away. The stare of that thing, if you can even call it a stare, stuck with me the entire time. It was like it had etched itself into my mind, cold, empty, a kind of darkness that seemed to look right through me, like I was just an obstacle in the way of something much older. That's when I began to understand. It wasn't just a simple scare. It got under my skin in a way I can't explain. Even now, whenever I think about it, I feel uncomfortable, like something is still there, waiting on that road at that exact. This happened to me not long ago when I was traveling with my 2 motorcyclist friends on the roads of northern Mexico. We love to travel together and explore different places in Mexico. We usually travel at night because we enjoy the trip more without the scorching sun. We've been doing this for many years, but after this incident, it took me a long time to get back on a motorcycle, as it left me with severe trauma. It was a normal night, the road was quiet, and there wasn't much traffic. It was early in the morning, but I don't remember the exact time. My friends and I were passing through a dirt road when we began to see something in the distance lighting up the road. It was fire. Something was burning in the woods, but we couldn't tell what it was because we were still a bit far. As we got closer, we could see there were 2 trucks. Yes, they were civilians, throwing what appeared to be lifeless bodies into a huge fire they had made. When I saw that, I shouted at my friends to speed up, but just a few meters ahead, my friend lost control of his motorcycle and crashed into a fence. Fortunately, nothing happened to him because he was wearing a helmet. He said he lost control because of the shock of seeing that. I looked back to see if those men had seen us, knowing they were dangerous, but what we saw next was much worse. We clearly saw a figure that seemed to be a man, but he was very tall and wearing a hat, walking through the flames. When he turned, we realized he had a tail, and his limbs were like those of an animal. The men throwing the bodies into the fire started laughing maniacally in a horrifying and terrifying way. They were enjoying what they were doing. My friend who had crashed began shaking uncontrollably. I told him to quickly get on my bike so we could leave as soon as possible, and that's what we did. We took off at full speed without looking back. We left my friend's bike behind. We were all in shock, unable to believe what we had seen that night. To this day, it's still hard for us to talk about it, and it's amazing how much evil was in those people, to the point where that creature appeared between the flames. Without a doubt, we were extremely lucky to get out of that situation unharmed.